Good evening, and welcome to the American Family Association's weekly cable program. The AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is the First Amendment, Two Viewpoints. And now our host, Frank Schroeder.
Hello, and welcome to the show. Today we're going to be taking a look at the issue of the First Amendment and its impact on some various issues that affect the American family. Joining me in the studio today for two different viewpoints on the First Amendment. First of all is Barbara Bernstein. Barbara, welcome again to our program.
Thank you
You're
very
back
much.
again for a return appearance. Barbara is the executive director of the Nassau chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union. Also joining me in the questioning is Marvin Zevin, who's a criminal defense attorney here in Nassau County. He is a cooperating attorney with the Nassau chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union. For an opposing view, many of you know Frank Russo, who is the state director of the American Family Association of New York. Welcome, everybody. When we get down to the questioning, first of all, the First Amendment reads as follows from our Constitution, both the Federal Constitution and the New York State Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to assemble peaceably. That is the First Amendment. Why don't we start with the first issue? I'll give you a question, Barbara. This has to do with the issue of pornography. As you know, the Supreme Court has made different rulings on pornography. First of all, with respect to obscenity, Supreme Court has found that obscenity is illegal. Pornography is not necessarily illegal per se. While some people believe that pornography should not be allowed, other people believe that it should be regulated to some extent, and other people feel that it should be totally unregulated. I wanted to find out your viewpoint on pornography, whether it should be regulated, and specifically, for example, should an explicit sex act, an act of oral sex, be allowed to be shown at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on ABC television?
Since I've never seen any of this on television, I don't even know what goes on. But I would say generally that if that falls under the definition of obscenity, and Marvin, you will...
No, not obscenity. Pornography. In other words, it is not illegal.
I guess what we're talking about is definitions, and the devil is in the details of whether something falls under the the standard of what is illegal and what isn't.
Let's take the example of pornography that has an act of explicit oral sex that has not been deemed illegal. It's not obscene. Should it be allowed to be shown at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on television?
I don't know. I mean, I don't even know if I agree with you about whether or not that kind of thing has been deemed to be obscene or just pornography. I really don't know.
For instance,
I mean, I can't answer that.
there are plenty of dirty movies that play around at different theaters.
Right.
It's pornography. It's not obscenity. It's not deemed to be obscene, but it's certainly...
Well, if it's pornography, then it should not be. Then it should not be censored.
So, in other words, it should not stay in a dirty movie theater. It should be allowed to be on television.
Are those kinds of movies shown at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?
Well, I'm asking you: should they be regulated? Should they be allowed? Should it be screened?
Well, any speech can be regulated as to time, place, and manner.
How about pornography?
Pornography, I would say no. I would say obscenity, yes. Pornography, no. And then you get into a definition of what. I would think that an act of oral sex would be considered under the obscenity standard. Marvin, you want to answer that?
Well, I'm amused.
Yeah.
The state of there was a case in California many years ago. It involved the draft, and it was during the Vietnam War. And a young man was arrested for carrying a sign which the state of California decided was obscene. And when the Supreme Court of the United States had a rule on that case, there was a two-line statement that they made. One man's obscenity is another man's poetry.
Okay.
Under those definitions, who's going to decide obscenity? Who's going to decide poetry?
Let's say the
And at
court
3
has
o'clock in the
decided.
afternoon, if the kids are in school, are you telling me that you are saying that the government can prevent some housewife from sitting at home getting her kicks watching an act of oral sex?
So you say that it should be allowed. It should not be regulated in any way. Let's say 4 o'clock when the kiddies are off the bus and now watching TV. Should a pornographic act, not an obscene act, be allowed on television on ABC or NBC?
You
Is that poetry or is that...
Historically.
Well, let me give Frank a shot.
Okay. In fact, Nadine Strassen, who's the national president of the American Civil Liberties Union, has answered this very question because I posed it to her in a debate at the Free Library in Philadelphia in 1994. And she said she would permit an act of oral sex to be shown on NBC television at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I totally differ with her. Again, we're assuming it's not obscene. It's in the
Correct.
context
Okay.
of a movie
Well, if it's
where there's, quote,
pornographic.
redeeming artistic or literary value. Which
What
then,
is your view?
my view is that it should be regulated. It should not be permitted at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Keep it in the dirty theater district.
Yeah, in other words, we have to weigh things. We all want freedom of speech and to get our viewpoint across. Something like this, how important is the viewpoint to be expressed? Is there some great political issue at stake here? And what is the impact on a 10, 12, 14-year-old boy who might be watching such television? My judgment, it comes down clearly that an act of oral sex should not be allowed on NBC television at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in contradiction to what the American Civil Liberties Union position is.
Question,
Oh.
who's going to regulate it?
Yeah.
The Federal Communications Commission. It does, and indeed, it is regulated by the FCC. It's just that the ACLU opposes that regulation.
So you want the federal government to regulate what we can see and hear just because they happen to think it falls into
Someone
How
has got to
about
exercise
if we
the
let
judgment. Someone does.
the
Can I-
ACLU
Barbara.
regulate it? Do you think,
Well, Barbara,
for
address it to
instance, an
Barbara.
act of pornography, should it be? Do you find that poetry, like The Leaves of Grass, or more like Hustler magazine?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
I'm not going to decide for somebody else whether it's poetry or obscenity. The whole point is that every person has to decide for himself. The American Family Association stresses the family. I agree with you. I think that the family should decide what comes into their television set at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that the government should not tell them. You are the people that are always saying the government has to stay out of people's lives, but you don't want the government out of people's lives when it comes to making decisions having to do with morality. You want the government out of people's lives well, let's name, I can't go through the list of what you want them out of, but you want them into people's lives, just making these moral/religious determinations. We say get the government out of your life altogether.
would
Let
you
the
respond,
mother or
Frank?
father decide what comes into that.
Unfortunately, today, too many moms have to work to pay the exorbitant taxes necessary to resolve the problems created by our liberal government.
Well-
so in point of fact, children are home at 3 and 4 in the afternoon. It's broadcast television. Clearly, someone has to regulate
Is the
this.
government now going to be mama and papa?
But the government shouldn't tell
I
us
mean,
not to smoke or anything.
Yeah,
They
the
shouldn't
government,
be in
the
our
government,
lives
Oh,
anyway.
the
wait a
government
minute,
does
wait a
pass
minute.
laws. You
This-
cannot sell cigarettes to minors. I favor laws like this.
Those are absolute public health laws.
Well, this is
and you're not saying that the government should not require
think-
people to wear helmets when they get on a motorcycle or wear seatbelts in a car. Those are
I
things that
support
regulate
those
public health
regulations.
and safety.
Yeah.
But this is not that kind of a
Oh, I
thing.
think
There
it
is
is.
no definite there's no definite correlation between viewing something that you consider obscene and the
not even
harmful
obscene.
result.
No, not even obscene.
I'm going
Pornography.
to move from the
Okay.
topic. I just wanted the point to be made because a lot of people, like you say, look at the American Family Association as being extreme, and I just wanted it to be clear for the record that we would oppose having pornography on TV and at the
In hours when
New
children are
York
apt to
Civil
be
Liberties
watching
Union
it.
would not.
Yeah.
Let me go on to another point. Actually, Marvin, I don't know
Marvin
if you
does.
wanted to have a follow-up question or if you have a question.
If Marvin should ask me a question, and you'll be asking Barbara.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, whenever anything goes wrong in our society, everybody wants laws passed. And everybody passes laws, and the laws are never enforced. And what you're saying is you want laws passed so that you're going to be protected by Big Daddy in Washington or in Albany from the realities of life. Is that what you want Big Daddy to tell you what you can see and
in
what
my
you can hear?
personal situation, my wife fortunately was able to stay at home. We had 7 children. She was able to stay at home, so we can regulate that. But today, 60% of moms of young children are working. There's no one home. The kids come home and no one's there. So to some extent, yes, I say certain matters clearly require some regulation. Explicit sex acts should not be permitted on broadcast television before, I don't think they should ever be permitted on broadcast television, but certainly not in hours when children are apt to be up before midnight, let's say.
Well, you
Wait a minute,
suggest...
but don't you think that it's up to the broadcaster and the advertisers?
Obviously, I don't.
of
I
the
don't think they should have that right.
Or us, the citizens, by turning off the knob so we don't watch it.
The 14-year-old won't turn off the knob.
Oh,
But you won't get sales
No,
of
as a matter of
General
fact, they'll-
Motors
they'll
cars.
turn it on.
Yes, but they're going to turn it on at 12 o'clock midnight. There is no way that you can keep a determined 14-year-old from getting access to whatever...
Sure, you put him to bed. A
oh.
14-year-old.
The mom is normally home by a
I
decent
know,
by
you're
10
putting an
o'clock.
awful lot of burden on a working mother, as if there's some distinction between her responsibility to her child and the mother who stays home. I know plenty of working women, including my own daughter and daughter-in-laws, who are totally responsible parents and are not home at 3 or 4 o'clock in the
Well, I'm
afternoon.
not saying they're not responsible.
Ask the average working
Yeah.
mother if
Yes,
she
but-
wants pornography on the TV, on
And not just
ABC, when she's not
But
home.
aren't you-
But why are you limiting
think
it
she'll be
to
burdened.
why are you limiting it to mothers?
Yes, right.
Clearly,
Well,
why?
the father-
Fathers or for anyone.
Fine.
The point is, I would say, explicit sex acts. I'm trying to take an extreme case of pornography that is not obscene. That's an example where I think appropriate a regulation is appropriate. It should not be permitted to be broadcast in the afternoon on broadcast
And-
television.
Last word, 15 seconds.
Yeah,
New
and
topic.
Mr. Russo, if you brought your child up right, your child is not going to do that. And if you say, well, I can't depend on that, then that's going to have an effect in every other area.
I'm worried about the other 14-year-old
You
if it was
cannot
going to
worry.
then attack my daughter because he saw that.
You cannot worry about the way somebody else brings up his child. You can only worry about your moral and your religious point of view on your own child.
Another
one
First
more,
Amendment issue.
One
Go
more
ahead.
question. Would you have banned all discussions of the Clinton-Lewinsky affair?
No.
Okay.
They gotta-
But he's similar to you. He likes definitions of
Yeah,
sex.
and words,
He,
words are different, but explicit sex acts being shown, I would object. If they tried to show President Clinton in any one of his 100 adulterous affairs, I would object to that.
What if the
we got to get off
okay.
pornography, but another
Okay.
First Amendment issue, and this
Okay.
had to do with something that we discussed last time on the show when you folks were on. That being, in 1994, Frank Russo gave
right.
a portrayal at the Port Washington Public Library
right.
on the Judeo-Christian view of homosexuality
Right.
in response to two gays that gave a rather sympathetic view of homosexuality. There was a lot of debate. There were a lot of protesters at the library who tried to shout Frank down, a lot of angry letters to the editor. Barbara, you agreed that Frank should have the right, his First Amendment right, to give his view at a public library
Absolutely.
of the Judeo-Christian view.
Right.
However, you also stated in a letter to the editor that every time a hate monger surfaces at our schools or libraries,
Right.
we should seize the opportunity and make it a lesson in exposing bigotry.
Right.
Is it your position that anything that Frank said at a public forum regarding homosexuality of the Judeo-Christian view is hate mongering?
No, and I'm glad, very glad to have the opportunity to respond to that because that came up at the end of the show and I was sort of felt sandbagged a little bit.
And I'm going to give you a full chance to respond.
Okay.
We're halfway through the show now, and I just want to thank you for joining us. You've tuned into the American Family Association Presents. We're taking a look at the First Amendment and its impact on some issues of the American family. Joining me are Barbara Bernstein and Marvin Zevin from the Nassau chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and Frank Russo, State Director of the AFA of New York. Go
Yes,
ahead, Barbara.
that letter, which I wrote, was in response to another letter which was outraged that Mr. Russo had a chance to express his views about gays, and said, does that mean if we have to let Mr. Russo talk about gays, that we have to let the Klan talk, and we have to let the Nazis have a space in a public library? And I said, yes, hate speech has a right. I mean, you cannot tell people, based on the content of their speech, that they cannot speak there. And even hate mongers, even hate speech, having no intention of referring to him as a hate monger, I'm using the letter writer's characterization of that speech as hate speech and saying, yes, even hate speech has a right to be broadcast or
So you
presented.
weren't referring to Frank as a
Absolutely
hate
not.
monger, or a view of homosexuality that the Judeo-Christian
No,
view, it would not be
no.
hate mongering.
I don't use the word hate monger
Or
generally.
bigotry.
Yes, I mean, I think that people, I have called people bigots. I have never used the
But
word
the
hate.
Judeo-Christian view of homosexuality.
No,
at public
I mean, I
library would
consider
be
that a
bigotry.
difference of opinion. I don't consider that anybody who has an opinion different from mine is a hate monger unless they've done something much more virulent than simply express views. Expressing views is simply expressing a difference of opinion. Hate mongering are people that do much more active.
Frank, how would you respond? First of
Yeah.
all, in giving that speech at the Port Washington Library, did you feel that you had a free chance of to give your First Amendment
No,
views?
the militant again, half the homosexuals there were very gentlemanly and polite and so forth, but half were very, very rude, trying to deny me my First Amendment rights.
Shouting you down. Some people had
Shouting
to be
down.
actually
One
ejected.
gentleman had to be ejected from the library by the police, and this gentleman since has been given money by the Suffolk County Legislature, by the way, Mr. David Kilnick. In addition, you know, the view of homosexuality that's a disorder, or that the act is immoral, that's simply having that belief in the minds of some militant homosexuals and others. That is automatically bigotry, and I strongly dispute that. In fact, when I hear someone say that, if someone is not using name calling, I don't want to see name calling involved with
what
homosexuals.
bigotry is.
Right, that's
Yeah.
big. But if you simply have the traditional Judeo-Christian belief that homosexuality is a disorder, you should not be called a bigot. And if you are, the person who's doing that is himself or herself an anti-Christian, an anti-Jewish bigot, and that's the only point.
You want to have a follow-up question or a comment?
You know, you seem to want to prevent other people from using whatever words they want to use to describe you.
No, I'm not. They can
And
use
if they
any
want to
words
call you a
want.
bigot, they can call you a
They can call
bigot.
me-
So Barbara
all I'm
said she did not call him a
Yeah.
hate monger or a bigot, but you would say that it would be okay for her to
Yeah.
do that based on his views.
Yeah, and I understand
No, what I'm
Barbara's-
saying is it would be all right for anyone to call him any name they wanted to based upon his hairstyle, the coat that he's wearing, the tie he's wearing, anything.
So names are okay, whether it's against gays or Jews or
He's saying,
blacks.
no, he's
or,
simply, I think Marvin's
Well,
saying he
wait
has
a
a
minute.
right to say that.
No.
But and all I would say is if someone does that, I have a right to interpret that person as maybe being a bigot himself or herself if the simple basis for that was my belief that homosexuality is a disorder and the act is immoral.
You know, there was an old child's phrase, you know, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt.
But you're
In our
putting,
American society, we call people names.
But would you agree, Marvin, it's inappropriate to call people names without basis?
it's interesting.
Sure, but that
That's all
doesn't
we're
mean
saying.
I...
You should have the right to say it, obviously.
It's interesting that you're putting the word hate monger in the same category as the N-word. In other words,
Did I just
Which
use
N-word?
the N-word?
no, but you're putting it in a category as if hate monger itself is a bad word. Do you understand? At least that's the way I'm
No,
interpreting
I'm just
what you're
hearing,
saying.
I just heard the right to call names. I haven't seen that in the Constitution, but it is free speech. But
Right,
the right to
but
call
the
names, I
usual,
guess,
but
is-
the bad names that we usually associate with bigotry
Mm-hmm.
are words like the N-words and other words that I will not name. But characterizing somebody who does that as meaning the word itself is a bad word, hate monger. I'm not calling you a hate monger. I think that we just have a disagreement of views. Is interesting that you put that in the same category. That it's a terrible thing to call somebody a hate monger, the way it's a terrible thing to use the hate words.
or a bigot when they're not being.
Yeah,
when
see,
they're
see,
not-
child abuse is wrong, but
Yeah.
to be falsely accused of child abuse is wrong. To be a hate monger is wrong, but
Yeah.
to be falsely accused of hate mongering or
Right.
bigotry is also
Oh,
wrong.
I-
It's immoral. I mean,
Let's
you have the
jump
right to do
okay,
that.
okay.
Let's jump
get
on
it.
to another
Okay.
topic, and this has to do with, again, the First Amendment prohibits the government from establishing a religion
Yeah.
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Right.
So if the government set up a school that promulgated a particular religion, that would be unconstitutional.
Right.
But why does the ACLU or the New York Civil Liberties Union oppose an educational voucher system whereby each parent is free to choose whatever school they want their child to go to so long as it has the basic educational objectives are met?
Well, the parent is free to, but the parent just should not dip his hand into the public treasury. Then
Doesn't the public treasury come from the parent's pocket?
no,
In other words, that's where the tax dollars come
That tax dollars, but vouchers means that I am paying for your child to get a religious education. That's
or I might pay for your child to get a non-religious education.
yes, but taxpayers cannot pick and choose the kinds of programs that they want to support. You cannot decide that because you didn't support the Vietnam War that you couldn't pay taxes to support that war. You simply, because if we did that, then we would not have a system of public.
So is your view that this would be establishing religion?
Yes,
A
that's
voucher
exactly
system.
exactly
Okay.
what
Frank.
exactly.
Clearly, I differ strongly on this. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, in fact, says that parents have a prior right to determine the environment in which their children will be educated. The parent should be able freely to choose the kind of environment that his or her child is going to be educated in. There's a crucifix in the room when his child is being taught mathematics, English, history, and science. That should be up to the parent. If the parent wants a satanic symbol, that's up to the parent. The parent should be free to choose what kind of educational environment, so long as the requirements of the state is spending educational tax dollars to teach math, history, English, and science. I don't want the state paying for the teaching of religion. So if religion is going to be taught, the cost of that religion instruction has to be borne separately by the parent. But for the teaching of math, English, history, and science, in a school where there might be a crucifix or a Star of David or a Muslim symbol, that should be permitted. And today what we have, in fact, is the converse. We have the government forcing parents to pick schools in which religion is attacked by virtue of the secular humanist viewpoint that permeates all of public education. The handing out of condoms, for example, which is deeply offensive to me, is done. It's done in public schools with my tax money. So I simply want the right to take my child out of that school environment and put it in an environment where there are no condoms being
And
distributed.
you have the right to do that, but if you do that, you still have to pay.
I have to pay
Yeah,
double.
you-
I'm being
Yes,
forced to pay
that's
double.
That's right. Well, if you want to have a private police force because you don't like, you're not getting enough protection from the county police force, you've got to pay for your own security guard. I want to get back, I want to just respond to your point about you're just teaching math, science, history, and English in the class, and there happens to be a crucifix on the wall. Well, the Supreme Court has said that's what's called excessive entanglement, because they would have to monitor exactly what goes on in that classroom.
Oh, in the public school, that means.
No, in
I
the
don't want the crucifix in the public
No, I'm
school.
talking about in your own private school. And the problem is you cannot separate out what goes on in the classroom, what comes out of the teacher's mouth, even though she's teaching or he's teaching math, science, because you yourself know that in the religious schools, the religious school has the right to reject anybody based on religion as far as teaching, because there is too much of a missionary impact of the teacher in the classroom. And it is because of that missionary impact, even though it's a math class, that we do not have the public coffers paying for private
No,
schools.
Last word, 15
yeah,
seconds,
I
we're
would
gonna
even
go to the topic. I'm
accept,
gonna
I
let
would
Martin
even
jump into
accept
it.
a requirement, as they have in Milwaukee, that the school cannot require the student in the religious school who receives public money, the voucher money, which is now constitutional in the state of Wisconsin. I would agree that the school should not be able to force the child to take the religion course if he doesn't want to. And he could be a child of a different religion.
I'm not
But the
talking about a
parent should-
religion course.
But the religion, the parent should be free to choose any school for his child, as long as the educational objectives of the state are met.
Marvin, 30 seconds.
No, you attack public schools for teaching secular humanism, whatever that is. Would you also attack the Catholic schools for not teaching Darwin's theory of evolution? Or are you saying that Catholic schools could teach A and public schools could teach B and let 1,000
Each school should be free to teach whatever theory it wants. Evolution is a theory, creationism is a theory. Each school should be free to teach both, or in fact, Catholic schools do teach this theory of Darwin alongside the theory of creation. The school should be free to teach either of those two. That's up to the school. But I want the basic requirements of math, English, science, and history. That's why the state taxes citizens to the tune of $300 billion and wants children to be educated. It's in the national interest to have children educated in those subjects, and therefore parents should be, now I'm simply saying parents should be entitled to their fair share of that educational tax dollar at the school of their choice. And this is the biggest thing that would help inner city parents in getting a quality education for their
But
children.
what would you do looking at history where millions of people get killed because either they're Jewish or Arabs or because they're Protestant or Catholics? You want to introduce into the United States what Europe has had for hundreds and thousands of years, so that eventually we'll get to the point where we kill people over religion.
No, it won't
That's what they do in Europe.
In fact, the Gallup poll, Marvin, just for your information, Gallup poll has shown there's more anti-Semitism among Catholics in public schools and among Catholic students in Catholic schools, because loving your fellow American as a brother or sister is taught in the Catholic schools.
You'd be
But-
concerned that a voucher system would turn the U.S. into Bosnia? Is that?
Yeah.
The voucher
It
system would
would.
turn us,
would-
you know,
no.
we're a great melting pot.
We're down to
Look at
3
the-
minutes. Go
Okay,
ahead, Jim.
I mean, if you just look at the numbers, if you talk about helping the inner city, that is a total fiction, because the voucher system would not provide more than $500 to $700 a family.
Not
There
the
is no-
vouchers I want. I
Well,
want
but you're not going to
$4,000
get that.
vouchers.
You're not going to get that.
would still save the
And-
taxpayers money.
And all a voucher system is going to do now is subsidize those kids that can already afford to go, middle-class kids that can already afford. It is not going to touch the poor.
Suppose we had a
It's
voucher
going to-
system. Suppose we had a
We'll have
voucher
a
system
separate show
restricted for the
on,
poor
we'll have a
children.
separate show on vouchers. Let me go on to
separate
one
show
other
on
point, and
Okay.
this is has to do with again the First Amendment. The federal government has recently been using the RICO laws to prosecute peaceful demonstrators at abortion clinics. The ACLU attorney and law professor Bruce Ledowitz has said the ACLU is so obsessed with the right to abortion that they don't recognize the implications of these RICO suits. Why hasn't the ACLU or the New York Civil Liberties Union intervened to defend the free speech rights of pro-life demonstrators in these absurd RICO lawsuits?
I'm not sure that the RICO suit is the way, using the RICO laws, and I don't know if people know what the RICO laws are, but I think maybe you can tell them what
Racketeer
they
and
are.
influence
Right,
Corrupt
right.
organizations.
Right. If you're getting to the general...
Usually used against the mafia. Go
Right.
ahead.
If you're getting to the general, that's probably to confiscate money. But if you're getting to the general point of whether what goes on in front of abortion clinics or the Nuremberg Files website in Oregon,
Right.
which has been declared not protected speech by the court, and it probably will be appealed.
And hailed by the ACLU, that
And
decision.
hailed by the ACLU. If you're getting to the point of whether that's protected speech or not, I don't think anybody's talking about the right of peaceful protest or even angry protest. I'm all in favor of angry protest. You can be as loud and as,
But not violent protests.
but not violent and not interfering with somebody else's right and that kind of.
We're down to our last minute.
So
so
the
respond,
RICO
Frank.
lawsuits clearly are an abridgment of the right to free speech by pro-life demonstrators. I do find the ACLU very hypocritical. On many issues, the ACLU is very principled. I disagree with them, but they're principled. On this issue, because of their obsession with the right to abortion, they have failed to be consistent and defend the free speech rights of peaceful demonstrators at the abortion
The
clinics.
problem
10
is that that
seconds.
speech has resulted in the murder of many abortion doctors and abortion providers, and their families and children are now terrified, and that reaches a different level, and that is what
That's the
is
last-
the problem with speech there.
Thanks for joining us. I would note that even the civil rights marches were much more violent than the pro-life movement. But in any event, thank you for joining us. This has been an enlightening discussion. We hope to have Barbara and Marvin on again. To gentlemen, gentlewomen, and thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you again next week, same time, same channel.